Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
And we're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, in the middle of Iowa, in between two rivers, which, Bud, we could really use the rain. They're very small at this point. But we're still on air all throughout Iowa Catholic Radio listening land, also on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, and, of course, our wonderful podcast listeners. This is The Uncommon Good. We are so glad to be with you. I am Bo Bonner, who, in addition to this show and other things as well, I work down at Mercy College of Health Sciences, where I'm the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing. Bud, what do you do yourself?
I'm always nervous to start saying it because it takes some time. I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I have to enunciate each word.
Luckily, liberal arts, one of the things that they do is, well, I guess, do we have public speaking classes? Is there speech classes?
Yeah, no, I taught one right before I moved to Pittsburgh in 2017. I handled speech.
Oh, you did?
What's it called? Small group communication.
Wow. How many times did you do that?
Just once. I needed like an extra credit to fill out my workload. That's
awesome. So is that why, like after that, you were really ready to rock radio after that?
Oh, yeah. I'm an expert really in small group communication. This is a small group, hopefully a larger group out on the airwaves.
That's right. But you can imagine it being a small group. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, the idea is we do all sorts of stuff here at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Mercy College of Health Sciences does all sorts of stuff for the greater Des Moines area and all the places that we send out our students. We want to thank them for underwriting the show, mchs.edu. We are rolling on through fall. We just got done with a fall break not too long ago, which of course means that before we know it, there's going to be Thanksgiving and then test and Christmas break. But I would say we are in the height of the academic year, and it's good to see everybody buzzing around, studying, and getting ready to jump into that healing ministry that is the hope and the goal of Mercy College's graduates.
Yeah, the fall semester especially seems to go really quickly. It kind of reminds me of college football. It's like one day you're watching Iowa State in 96-degree weather, and then all of a sudden it's Thanksgiving. And with school, with the semester here at Mercy College of Health Sciences, once you get past Thanksgiving, man, that's like the last quarter of a 400-meter.
That's right. I think Iowa fans talk about the seasons progressing by how hard the ball feels when you punt it. Early on it's like light and nice, and then it gets to be like a heavy brick. But there they are, punting in the fourth quarter, still figuring out how to win, like 9-4 or whatever.
That punter is impressive. I'm having these nightmares already of Nebraska losing like 7-3 on Black Friday, which is better, I guess, than 28-7. Not really. The close ones hurt more.
I know. In some ways, it's like they have figured out how to make time. Like Einstein needs to come back to life and measure if time relatively goes slower during Iowa games.
It's impressive. I don't know. I really dislike them, but they keep like every football team really sustains injuries. They keep dropping like offensive players, and Brian Ferentz is like,
it'll be okay.
What's the meme about like, God, why do you keep giving me the greatest crosses? Or it shows the guy like withering away,
and because you're my sturdiest soldier or whatever.
Like Brian Ferentz, it's not like I'm not praising his mastermind. I'm praising just sort of their ability to win games by getting less than 200 yards, in a game.
We're of course talking about Newman, and he says to remain perfect is to change often. I think Brian Ferentz would argue, or at least he's not up to that, right? He's not trying to change too much, but they keep winning games. So I'm not saying that the Ferences are over against John Henry Newman's theory of development, but it'll be interesting to see. Today, what we seriously have is another aspect, another round of our radio reading roundup with John Henry Newman. We're going to talk about his educational and theories, his education and knowledge theories, before we then start next week with his sermon. This is The Uncommon Good. Bob Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We appreciate it, whether you're listening live on air on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or listening later on podcast. Thank you for joining us. We are doing our radio reading roundup, St. John Henry Newman, and we're rolling on. We talked about his life, Bud. We talked about how his life then led to some of his greatest known works about development, church history, things like this. Today, we're going to talk about education and knowledge, how that plays in his works, before we get into what I would say is the heart of the radio reading roundup with John Henry Newman, where we'll start doing a sermon per show, maybe a sermon or two. But the idea is we'll get into his sermons, which I would argue are the most accessible aspects of John Henry Newman, but in some ways are the least read. I don't know if that's true, but I think more of the people out there who want to get into John Henry Newman, maybe you don't tackle his major works. His sermons are fantastic. But today we're going to talk about education. So, Bud, where I think this naturally leads from the last show is that Newman's life, as we pointed out, has pushed him to make occasional considerations of things. He writes all sorts of things. He has a broad swath of interests. But what really ever compels him to write are very specific things about occasions, controversies, difficulties that emerge from his life. Education is this background of his, like Oxford and everything, so it makes sense that the Irish university. We'll talk about the idea of a university later, which is in many ways his most impactful, maybe, consideration of my life about, we're in university and college education. But I actually think it does connect to what we talked about last time. So he has this very difficult work, and maybe his most difficult, do you want to throw that out there as that adage? Yeah. The grammar of assent, which is something you should not start with, where he starts talking about the illative sense. We'll get what we mean that in a second. But this stems precisely from the same interest he had in church history, development of doctrine, how it is in the modern world, his modern world of the 19th century, that we all don't have to be, so to speak, super mega brain science types that have to know absolutely everything about the faith. And in some ways, his most difficult, most epistemological work, this idea of the grammar of assent, was based off something that is about the people. So he has this idea that maybe we should start with, that about the faithful and their role in church doctrine. So let's start there, and then I think we can extrapolate about how he gets to the grammar of assent for that. And I think, Bud, to give a shout-out to our friends, you were listening earlier this week to the Newman Institute, and they had people talking exactly about the role of the faithful in John Henry Newman.
Yeah, so I would back up a little bit, and last week we talked about his theory of development. Newman was always a very nimble thinker, and I contrast him with the idea of like a fundamentalist Christian, where there's just these like strict propositional truths, and you believe them with certitude, like the Bible says it, therefore I believe it. Rome is spoken, the matter is closed. Both of those stances are good instincts. But as we talked about last week, Newman was really concerned about the real, like how things really are. And so when he becomes Catholic, he doesn't just say like, well, I guess I can stop writing and thinking because, the church's magisterium gives me all the answers. He continues to really wrestle with church history. He says, how does the church most faithfully live out its mission? And this comes up for him in a very like profound, kind of difficult way in the lead up to the First Vatican Council. So the First Vatican Council, we mentioned last week, began in 1869. It wrapped up by force in 1870, like troops invaded Rome, so they had to close things down.
Things got real.
Yeah.
Epic. But
there was a group at the council. They were like papal maximalist. Again, I think like one of them, Cardinal Manning, I really respect. Yeah, he fought for various like workers' rights and different social justice causes. But they had a really strong understanding of papal authority. So, for instance, there's one of Newman's friends, another convert to Roman Catholicism, William George Ward. He said he wanted a papal bull or document with his newspaper every morning. You know, like, really, the Pope speaking, that's the most important thing. And I mean, to kind of caricature it, like, it's kind of like if the Pope has an aside at dinner, you know, like that possesses this kind of like authority or infallibility. If you think I'm exaggerating, like, you know, there were some maximalists who they would take like hymns written to the Holy Spirit and they would like insert papal terminology and things like that. So, I mean, just like a really kind of exaggerated understanding of papal authority. Newman himself is invited to the council. And so there's bishops who are saying, like, you can make a real contribution. He sort of blames. He's like, I'm a homebody. I don't really know a lot of other languages. He says, like, a theologian should be able to, like, rifle through, like, historical documents, and my mind doesn't really work that way. My thesis is, like, all those things being true, Newman stays home, and I've written a book about this, and he writes that work that Bo was talking about, The Grammar of Assent. And The Grammar of Assent, ironically, it's Newman's densest work, and it's the toughest to get into. But his goal in that book is to defend the simple faith of everyday believers. Yeah. And my point here, like what I'm driving at when you look at this historical background is, so at this time you have to remember there's different philosophical currents who are attacking traditional faith. So the medieval theologians were no dum-dums. I mean, they were really smart guys, but they're facing different sorts of issues with the rise of Enlightenment philosophy and then really skepticism in the 19th century, you know, different, we don't need to get into the philosophical currents, but like Darwinianism and different kinds of historical criticism in Scripture are forcing theologians to ask new questions. And Newman says we can't solve all these matters just by pretending like the Pope is an oracle who receives revelations from heaven.
Right.
The Pope is an important office set up by God to do important things. But even, so Newman makes this whole point, even a papal statement, it requires interpretation. And the interpretation, the wrestling, that takes part in the place of theologians who are kind of like, he compares them to lawyers, like legislation is passed. They kind of wrestle with its implications and its reach. But also, like Bo's mentioning, the sense of the faithful. The faithful have an instinct for the faith. And Newman says, like, when the entire body of Christ, through various forms of discernment, you know, I was going to say leans in a certain direction, but when they come to a conclusion, we can trust that to be a truth given by God. But it operates as a body with parts with different kinds of discernment. And Newman says, maybe the Pope could operate by himself and sit in a room and sort of like wrestle with these things. It's far better if he's relying on theologians, and even like Pius IX did with the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, gauging what the faithful across the world believe.
And that idea of the sense of the faithful, and it's like you said, tell me if I'm wrong, it's an intuition and an instinct, he thinks. It's not like, oh, we throw it out to like popular opinion and we like throw out surveys and see what people say. It's almost like, not preternatural is not even the right word, but this gets into the illative sense is what I'm getting at, is It doesn't have to be speculative, demonstrative. It doesn't even have to be like intuitive logic. It's not that you're going to like throw it out to the faithful and like, oh, well, that's an argument I haven't thought for. There's this way in their collective intuition and instinct that they have a BS meter in some way. I mean, there's this question of like, why is it, right, that, and I think this is an easy one to throw out, when Nestorius is trying to say we shouldn't call Mary Mother of God, or Theotokos, right, the God-bearer, the people just revolt. They're like, of course that makes no sense, right? And the theologians, of course, then say, this is why the faithful think that you're so far off on this, and they elucidate it, like you said, the lawyers might. In throwing this out with our good friend Jenny Martin, who's one of the people who was talking, I proposed that it was something like dark matter in physics. Whatever else dark matter is, it seems to be just the sort of stuff in the universe that slows down the expansion of the universe so that it doesn't blow apart, but that it actually can develop into things like stars and planets because it has to move through, it's not even a viscous source, but I'm just thinking that's how we think of it, right? It's the thing that slows it down enough so that something can develop. And it seems that the sense of the faithful is something akin to that, Bud. And when he's getting at what he calls the illative sense, which, of course, already he's losing people, using that. He's showing off his Oxford education. But precisely it's this idea of, like, why do we assent to things reasonably that we can't give in a sort of Cartesian mathematical geometric proof? And that's what he's trying to wrestle with. But it's like we said, it's coming from the circumstance of why should we trust the sense of the faithful, and that it has a part in the way that these debates, this development of doctrine happen.
Yeah, when you mention the illative sense, there are two images that Newman gives that I think are really helpful to put flesh on that idea. He says, like, and this is before weathermen on the news, of course, but like he said, how do you know if a storm's coming? Well, a person you can really trust is a farmer who has spent years out in the field and sees the signs of it. Now, there's a meteorologist who could run all sorts of computer graphs and things, and we know they still very often get it wrong. But Newman says, like, a person who has that long personal experience, they, like you said, like, kind of instinctively, they don't even, like, if you press them, like, how do you know a storm's coming? Like, they could put it down on paper, but they don't really need to. Like, it's this, like, instinct's not the right term necessarily.
I think it's like, I think it's phronesis. I think it's practical wisdom.
Practical wisdom.
But it's not, like you said, it's not like the discursive part of practical wisdom. It's the sort of, it's the habitual part of it.
Yeah.
It's like habitual prudence.
Well, and that kind of relates to the other image he gives, and he says that of a physician. And when, like, if you're sick, especially if you need medical care quickly, and the physician says, like, oh, you're suffering from this ailment, you don't say to him, like, well, tell me why. I mean, he doesn't go through, like, well, this organ is connected to that one, ergo, da-da-da.
Right.
He recognizes the signs, and if he's, like, an experienced, like, good physician, or she, like, we'll kind of, like, recognize that very quickly. And if before going through, like, invasive surgery or something, maybe do further tests, but has this kind of phronesis or practical wisdom. And he says the church, like, as an organism has that, but even, like, he talks about, like, the peasant woman clutching her rosary beads, and she might have this, like, she might reach conclusions that are justified certitude, even though she hasn't taken several theology classes. And Newman's not anti-intellectual by any means, but in fact, like, the theology classes could be a negative influence in her life if they sort of lead her to question the practical wisdom that she's already reached.
And this is like, so we would have to have several more shows to, like, really on air try to, like, unpack everything he talks about in the Grammar of Assent. But this, I think, starts to point to what we'll get at, especially in the second half of the show, about his understanding of what a full education, so to speak, needs to be. But to your point, if you get theology and it's sort of detached from a wider circle of knowledge, it would actually occlude the illative sense in that person. And it's not because they're dimwits or they're not smart enough. It's because if you form, so to speak, the intellect in a what he'll call sort of philosophical habit of mind, it will maybe know something really particularly, but in a sort of outsized way. Not to, like, go too far afield, but that's what we do here at the Uncommon Good. But Robert Harrison has a wonderful podcast called Entitled Opinions, and he's actually talking about, I'm going to mess up the first name. It's an Italian name. Giambattista Vico, which most people know as Vico. Vico, of course, writing in the 19th century too, writes a book called The New Science. What does he care about, Bud? He talks about beginnings. He's someone that, like, people throw out, like, idea that he has, like, a sort of how institutions evolve and have cycles. Funny enough, kind of in the same world that John Henry Newman is in. He's down in Italy. Very misunderstood, I think, most of the time. What I'm getting at is he, too, was sort of tired of the Cartesian revolution, where everything was sort of like, if you can make any science realm of knowledge like a sort of geometric point dot matrix, that was the more sure knowledge was, right? The guiding metaphor for everything was sort of geometric proofs in math. In a similar way, what he wants to ask is not, like, all things being contextual. It's absolutely true that some of the more postmodernist and modernist people take from Vico this lesson, Vico was trying to get at this similar thing with Newman, which is, why are there sort of cycles of development of things falling apart? Why is it that we overdo it with this sort of singular idea of knowledge? The illative sense, right, is this sort of long-standing fact that people actually make a lot of progress in knowledge before they have sort of specialist knowledge. And not everyone has to be absolute masters at all parts of every science before they can start to speak. Newman has this really interesting thing. I think it's in his lectures on the Benedictine schools. So he'll talk about 3 ages of the church, the Benedictine, the Dominican, and the Jesuit age, which he goes are the poetic, the dialectical or science, and then the rhetorical age. And he makes this really, I've talked about this in front of the Benedictines before, that he says, of course, this is something that sort of showed in the church. It has to show up in every age. But he makes this point that the poetical, right, like the idea of being in wonder and awe at the sort of totality of the church, of Christ's mysteries, of being able to point out something that draws us outside of ourselves towards Christ, towards the church, is the first age, as it were, that needed to happen in the church and that the Benedictines sort of took up the mantle of, but that we all have to rediscover before we get into the argumentative dialectical science of the Dominicans or the rhetorical sort of public oratory aspect of the Jesuits. The reason I say this is that's why there's some ways in which the person clutching their rosary has a better poetic understanding of the truths of the faith. And though they're not going to be able to give you the dialectical science, like the proofs of the faith, or they might not even be able to speak eloquently in public as to convince maybe someone who's having an argument, in their sort of poetic embrace of the totality of the faith, they shine forth in a way that even the professionals can't ever seem to muster.
Well, and that's where faith really is. Our theology is faith seeking understanding. So again, Newman's not anti-intellectual, and he praises for those who have faith, like we should seek out to better understand the reasons for our faith. But this, to me, even though, again, this is like welcome to the jungle in terms of just, like how dense and like you really need to bring your intellectual machete to get through. That sounds more intense than I mean it. Like Rambo theologian right here. But
right.
I'm mixing a lot of metaphors. Like it can be tough sledding reading the grammar of a sin, but I think there's a lot of payout for how we do discipleship because not everyone comes to the faith in the same way or at the same time. Newman uses this really interesting example of like a smaller shape. Like think of a pentagon that's inside of a larger circle. He says, now imagine the pentagon sort of like expanding outwards. And he says, at what point does it like merge with the circle? Like it's really hard to say like, well, we've reached kind of like this sort of like now they match. And that's kind of how our minds work. So it's tempting, especially when you're working with youth, to try to give them that one argument that's going to seal the deal.
Yep.
And Newman compares that approach to sort of like, say you come across like a raging stream or whatever, too dangerous to cross by wading through the water. He says there's a way that you can get across it just by dropping like a large branch over the gap, over the chasm. He says the danger there is like you put too much weight on that branch and you're going to end up in the water. What you actually want is like a cable made up of many hundred, many thousand strands. And that's kind of how we approach faith. So it's like, what's the thing that brought me to faith? For most of us, it's not sort of like some strict logical argument. It's not even necessarily like, well, someone proved to me that the Bible's historical. There are all these different strands. There's the witness of our parents. There's the sacraments of the church. There's the beauty of the sacred liturgy. All of these things together come to form like one like really strong cable that has kind of give and bend. And what's great about that is if one strand breaks, maybe like at times you find like your experience of Mass sort of dry or whatever, you've got all these other sorts of things backing it up. Whereas, I mean, we can think about people in our own lives. Like you think about the great, I say great, like the really skilled scholar Bart Ehrman, who's one of the best like historical critics out there. And when I say historical critics, like he knows the New Testament back and forth,
and like
including all the like textual variants.
Yeah, exactly.
But he grew up in a context where it's like it was biblical fundamentalism, and when at Princeton he was faced with these textual variants and that like maybe we don't know what the original autographs exactly said. It destroyed his faith. The branch snapped.
Man, that is a perfect way to do this. Look, there's only 30 seconds, so I'm not going to get in my next point. I'll throw out my next point at the beginning, and it will get us into what eventually the idea of the university, which I think we can talk about the circumstances that bring it up, but why, even though it technically, quote-unquote, failed that university, why it has such an enduring legacy. But you'll want to stick around, folks. It's great. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We're doing our radio reading roundup on John Henry Newman, speaking about all things knowledge, education, before we jump into what is going to be a whole heap of fun going through his sermons, not like all of them, but some of his greatest hits. But, man, we've covered a lot of ground regarding how the happenings on the ground led John Henry Newman to expound on the idea of the grammar of assent. Like, how is it that we assent to things, especially when we're not technical masters of every field? That got us into how it is that the church throughout the ages has different foci about like what's important, but that there's ways in which the faithful and the sense of the faithful is always, so to speak, the root cause that branches out into further sort of scientific and rhetorical knowledges and arguments being made for the faith. What I find interesting, you left off on such a great, interesting thing that I can't go too far in this regard, and I know I'm bringing it back up, but your image from Newman about how, like, the circle is reality, and then you inset a pentagon, and then, what we keep doing, right, as we keep going along, is sort of making, like, and then we make a hexagon, and then it's an octagon, right? We keep rounding off as much as possible to match the circle, the interior shape, and that's sort of what learning is, right? Like, we're never going to, like, hit it exactly on this side of heaven, but we keep making progress that way, and that's not really relativism or changing things. That's sort of trying to match reality as much as we can under our human auspices. So to bring up Vico one more time in the new science, this stuff, folks, it's just swimming in the 19th century. So John Henry Newman is not sort of like some old fogey trying to throw religion one last bone before the modern world. He really is imbibing and speaking to the spirit of the age. What a lot of people misunderstand, and I think this is an interesting parallel, Bud, what a lot of post-humanists, so like the modernists and the postmodernists, misunderstood about Vico is Vico thinks he's being conservative about this and is arguing against Cartesianism. And so what happens is people call him a proto-constructivist take on science. And I can't get into it too much, but this idea is, what he was doing is saying we only have models in our head, and the models we get as close to reality, but they maybe never have any sort of purchase. Whether that's what he argued or not, I think can be debatable. What I'm trying to get at is Newman, like you're matching up with the shapes, but also the many chord arguments. People, I think, who misread Newman now go, he's a relativist, or not like all the way a relativist, but he's willing for everything to change, right? We should throw away everything that went before us. But he's not saying that. He really is arguing there's real correspondence between that inner shape and reality, and there's really is a single chord that stretches across. It's just that the chord is made of many parts, and the shape can get keeping finer distinction, but we shouldn't be surprised that as we go along, we make corrections and find things that make that shape, which is human knowledge, match more to the infinite mystery of the circle. A circle is a great way to put it, of course, because circles are never ending, right? And there's no perfect circle on Earth. We get as close as we can. The reason I think this is a good lead into the idea of a university, and I'll turn it over for you a little bit to just provide a bit of history in a second. But for Newman, the biggest problem facing what he saw happening in the universities of that day was the sort of overtaking of not like constructivism or postmodernism, is really utilitarianism, which is this idea that knowledge is useful, and what we need to do is focus on knowledges that are useful and exclude any that are just sort of old and wretched and by the wayside. This is interesting because on one hand, right, Oxford, where Newman spent so much time, is a paragon of the old ways, and rightfully so, can be criticized for being too aristocratic and too sort of hung up on its own reputation. So a lot of new schools, and literally one called the New School, I believe, right, in London.
Oh, maybe.
Yeah, it's like King's College is the New School.
Okay.
I think so, but I might be wrong on this. But the idea is, we're going to use knowledge and make it useful and stop making it so elitist.
Yeah.
And so I understand very much the impulse about like, okay, if you guard off knowledge too long from the hoi polloi, they're going to get mad and do their own thing. But the problem was equally powerful people who just happened to not be Oxford types wanted to get their hands on using the power of useful knowledge and sort of flattening the sort of robustness of true knowledge, because when you do that to people, you can manipulate them.
Yeah.
You can, and so if you think the entire world is people to be manipulated, nature to be manipulated, laws of nature to be manipulated, you start to see how not only arrogant but anti-human all of this is. And Newman, as much as maybe people were right, like, I mean, Bud, he went to Oxford, he maybe a little bit. Maybe had a little bit of an arrogant streak because he was an Oxford boy. However, on his best read of what he's trying to get at is to succumb to that idea of education is to give up the robust fullness of the human intellect, and very much so to give up on the idea about how faith and reason go together.
Yeah, Bo, you have to really love Newman for his anti-utilitarian streak. And any project that he undertook, he was really honest about what it was about. And he was really averse to this idea like, well, you do this to achieve like a certain kind of practical end. And so, even apologetically, people would be like, oh, like Protestant nations, they're doing better. They've got better train tracks and like the people are better off. And Newman, rather than, you could kind of confront that head on and say like, well, let's really look at like,
train stats, yeah.
or like the dining in Spain versus the United States or whatever. But he said, look, like Catholicism or the faith is not about like making people better off per se. So he's really honest about that. You're talking about these arguments around education. At the time in England, there was, after the Industrial Revolution or as it's taking place, like it created some real inequities between people and some real difficult circumstances in large cities. And there were some educators who said like, well, let's just give the poor books and they'll become more moral. And Newman's like, just being exposed to education or like reading books is not going to accomplish that end. There is a way to talk about morality and ethics. It's its own science, but it's not simply like, let's just put them in libraries.
Oh, and I mean, I've always loved this defense of him, which I think is the chief way Catholics misunderstand Newman on education. He says the good of the intellect is different than moral good.
Yeah.
And then he also says that it's like distinct from the body, but he actually goes, look, let's take those, and this gets to, I think, the heart of what we're after, is he goes, look, what is the good of the body that you would want no matter what? Health, right? Health is the good of the body, and health is useful if you have it, but if you try to get health for the use of it, you'll never attain it. Health is just good to have on its own. It has benefits after that, but health is good on its own. Similarly with morality, what's the good of morality? Virtue. Virtue is just good to have. To be a virtuous person is its own reward. Virtuous people do other things better, but he goes, if you try to be virtuous for the sake of something else, you throw virtue away. Now, what he points out is English has this problem because, Bud, similar to the body and health and the moral life with virtue, what is that for the intellect? Yeah. And he goes, we don't have one word, so he throws out a bunch. The one that I keep coming back to is the philosophical habit of mind, which is a mouthful. But what he's saying is the intellect has a good that's good for its own sake. And the minute that you start trying to attain it just to get other things, you will never get it. But he goes, knowledge for its own sake is just like, who wouldn't want to try to make people healthy? Who wouldn't try to make people virtuous? Why would you deny trying to make people have that intellectual habit of mind that is the good for its own sake of the intellect? Why denigrate human reason? And so this is where he gets into why this sort of Cartesianism, or like what we talked about, is like theology unattached to anything else. Yeah. The human intellect's good occurs in a circle of knowledge where you get the breadth of knowledge itself. Yeah. So it's never just an attainment or a mastery of any one field. Now, we want that, and that's why we have universities, we have masters and doctors and fields. But what's really important at the start of all this is to have an appreciation in the student for this breadth of knowledge that makes them have a habit that's like health, that's like virtue, but for the intellect.
And as we touched on last week, Newman is writing about all of these things like circumstantially. What I mean by that is he's not padding his resume. All of this comes up for him as he's going about his ministry. So at the first segment of the show, we talked about his ideas around the sense of the faithful. The whole reason this came up is, so Newman's helping edit this periodical, and one of the editors gets into hot water for writing a piece that kind of torques off the bishops. What occasioned it is, so Catholics have their own schools, and to receive some level of government funding, like we run into this today, there's inspectors that have to go to schools. And so the bishops face this question, like, should we receive some financial relief if doing so means that we have to have non-Catholics come and make sure like our schools measure up to certain, I'll say accreditation standards. I don't think they use that language, but like that sort of idea. And the bishops ultimately say no. They're torqued about this article that's written, and that's what sparks Newman's whole conversation around the sense of the faithful. He's like, look, I'm not super bothered by the conclusion that you came to, but if you're going to ask the faithful about the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, like when it comes to how we run our schools, like maybe they have something to say on that as well. And so that kind of starts his whole arguments, are like his whole wrestling with the sense of the faithful. This leads into, he's asked to found a university in Ireland, and it's a university precisely that's meant to be for Catholics because, so for instance, I'm kind of jumping from nation to nation, but like at Oxford, you had to sign on to the Anglican Articles of Religion to attend there.
Right.
So Catholics, of course, would not. So they're going to create their own schools. Newman agrees, like he accepts the invitation from the Irish bishops to found the school. But he says, if you're going to have me do this, I'm going to do this right. And part of this, like this is where, I mean, it breaks down for a number of different reasons. The school persists, but Newman leads it just for a short while. And part of it is the bishops in Ireland say like, well, we want clerics to be teaching these classes. And Newman says, if I'm going to hire faculty, like that's not going to be, that is going to be a consideration, but it's not going to be my primary consideration. And so again, like the topics that we teach there, the people we hire, all of these will be driven by what is the university about, not sort of like just simply practical outcomes.
And this to me is where Newman is brilliant and where we as Catholics often don't hear him. Because the reason he gets in trouble, like you said, is he's like, I'm not going to like inject superficially Catholicism into classrooms just so it looks like we're being Catholic. He goes, it's important. In fact, it's of cardinal importance that theology and philosophy, even if they're sort of like the root of all these things. So and I know there's arguments about maybe a circle's wrong because it makes it sound like there's more equality than there is. But what he'll say is, if knowledge is like a pie, you can have this idea that maybe like this subject has a bigger slice than the other. But the point is they all have to be seen as constitutive of the one whole. This gets back to sort of the cable argument, right? Yeah. And his point is if you evacuate any of them, it won't just be a holding place until it comes back. The other parts of the pie will take that over, and now it seems holistic, and it's not. So he goes, if theology is to be the queen of the sciences and philosophy is going to be the handmaid that makes all of these, the uni part of a university make sense, they have to take their place next to the other sciences and not be just a sort of superficial covering or icing on top of what they do. So he's like, of all things, right? He goes, if a university, if it needed to get rid of, like he said, either like, I think like libraries and dorms or professors, he says get rid of the professors to make sure that people are able to research and come discuss what they find. Now, again, that's more of a rhetorical thing. He, of course, thinks there needs to be professors. Yeah. But he goes, it's not just this sort of like storehouse of knowledge that you download in people's heads. It has to be this idea of seeing the holistic way in which the sciences all interweave in this circle of knowledge.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important point, and it's worth kind of sitting in for a moment. So Newman, again, he gets back to what's the core idea of a university. Now, there's arguments about whether he gets the etymology completely right, but he said a university, and I think this is true, it claims to teach universal knowledge. Any aspect of human knowing. We're going to cover it, and you can come here and study it. Now, Newman, shots fired. This is where, man, Bo, he's still so prescient. He says theology is a science. The church has always staked this claim. It's not the same kind of science as biology, for instance, but it's a deductive science. So we believe in revealed truths, and then you can organize those truths and weigh them against each other. Again, test their reach, all sorts of things like this. And so he says, if a university says it teaches universal knowledge, then you can't, so to speak, like bracket theology and philosophy. There are different kinds of sciences than the ones that we tend to think of, but they're sciences nonetheless. Here's the important point, and I think you can show this at universities today. Like you said, if the university says, well, we're not going to do theology because, it's not as rigorous or it's not science as we define it. He says, if you create that sort of vacuum, then other fields are going to rush in to fill it, but they'll just do it poorly. You can see this today with the new atheists. Richard Dawkins, I don't know, I haven't read his works on evolutionary theory, but supposedly in his own field, very highly respected. When he starts talking about God and metaphysics, it's worse than a first-year philosophy student.
Yep.
Theology departments have they've sort of sold their birthright because they were called to do this specific certain vocation or task. And they said, well, to be respected in the eyes of the world, we'll do religious studies. And religious studies will look at the phenomenon of human rituals. And realistically, they're still going to probably get cut from budgets and things. But then all of a sudden, we don't have people doing theology. And you read religious studies literature, everyone wants to eventually move to those big questions that really matter to people. But again, they don't have the rigor and the training necessary to do it well.
And I mean, what's interesting about this is, so where I personally got, this is where I really started to get tied in with Newman studies. Before it was mostly because I just knew people like you, of course, and close friends who were in it. But his 10th lecture in the second part, so the first part of the idea of the university is it proper, and then there were these later lectures that he gave that were tied to it. But the last one he gives to the medical school, which, if I'm not mistaken, but is the only really successful part of the Irish college university that existed. But it's interesting because what you're assuming is going to happen is that Newman's going to just poo-poo, medicine and how dare it usurp, where it shouldn't. But he actually goes off and says, look, actually the problem with medicine is its staggering power and success. He goes, it makes sense that people start looking to medicine to answer questions that he goes, it can't. Of course, that's where people look. But this is crazy. This is the 19th century, so he's not even seen heart transplants or stuff like this. And prophetically points out, of course, people will keep asking medicine to answer questions that are not proper to its field because it does its own field so well. Yeah. But so what happens, of course, is, humanity is not just flesh and bone. That's one of the things he points out. But when you allow this, when you start giving, and theology may be the worst of all culprits because it should, have such a regal nature, and it's given it, like you said, given away its birthright for pottage. But all of the humanities and a lot of the sciences, bud, bend to whatever is most powerful, which currently is medicine and economics, right? Mm-hmm. And so people start to say, well, we're just adapting to the times, but what it really is doing is not doing medicine a service. When you keep pressing medicine to do something that's not its role, it's no wonder that it runs afoul. Medicine is like anything else and needs that partnership. And to not do it is to not just go wrong by theology. It's to do wrong by medicine and everything else. And that's one of his main points. I got a chance to give a paper and write one with Kristen Collier about this on a panel. If people want to go find this out. But to me, that really made me go, oh, even at a health science school, Newman's point, it's not just for the few Oxford colleges that get to sit back and smoke a pipe and read books. The necessity of asking for a holistic education and integrating the philosophical habit of mind, the highest good for its own sake of the intellect, it has repercussions all down the line, even today, even in the professional schools.
Yeah, I mean, Newman says in that lecture that bodily health is not the only end of man, and medicine forgets that to its own detriment. Now, the temptation in the other direction is to say, again, like you were intimating, we'll sprinkle a little spirituality on the end of life.
Yep.
But no, there's other fields of knowledge. There's other aspects of human nature that medicine itself has to address. It just has to yield sometimes to other experts. I'm not using expertise like in the managerial sense, but truly someone who knows, say, about the sacraments when it's dealing with the Catholic patient. Man, there's so much we could get into. I know we're up against the clock. I'm thinking about Jeffrey Bishop, friend of the show.
Anticipatory corpse.
Anticipatory corpse. He started to look back at how we even do autopsies or how we expose, what's it called? Like, like showing students a corpse.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Like in anatomy classes, like how we go about those, dissection and things. That's impacted the way that people think about the ends of medicine, with care at the end of life. And for a doctor to go to a family and say, I kept your husband and dad's parts in motion for as long as possible, like medicine itself is doing a disservice. And that's where the entire scope of knowledge and these different fields of science truly do matter.
Absolutely. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. But it's always a good indication that we had a good show when right at the end of the third segment, we're like, now we could have gone this whole branch. But suffice it to say, one more time, John Henry Newman's theory of education is not merely pertinent to like a couple liberal arts Catholic colleges that want to sort of like live in the nostalgic past. I think maybe more than anyone, the forethought he had and the warnings he gave in education, in knowledge, the sense of the faithful, the grammar of assent, these are the live questions of today. And he just saw the problems in a way that I think maybe in the Catholic Church sometimes we miss. I think other people were worried about this stuff too, but it's interesting for me about how Newman continually sees the arguments of his day, but speaks in such a way that it's almost like the real germination of his thought is most potent now.
Yeah, this conversation was really exciting for me because we always mention each week that we're underwritten by Mercy College of Health Sciences. It sort of made me excited about like to go back to my job after we're recording because you've got this school here in Des Moines that is trying to do all of these things well. So care for the human person, but also we've got philosophy classes. We care about mission, mass each week on campus, trying to bring all those things together. We can't pretend like we do it perfectly, each and every semester or whatnot, but I think it's worth fighting for those goals. Another thing worth joining in is our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. You can pray the rosary with us. We broadcast it on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. And then also the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:55 in the afternoon. Please use the Iowa Catholic Radio app, not only to stay up with events and what's happening in the diocese, but also to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
And I know very certainly I've got a chance to talk with folks at Iowa Catholic Radio. We have a big ask and a big hill to climb to get to the funds we need to make Iowa Catholic Radio work by the end of the year. I know we had our fall fundraiser, and I know we ask every time, but I redouble the ask coming up here into November here pretty quick, into December. Folks, if you have it in your capacity, please give to Iowa Catholic Radio so that we can keep this ministry that is not just the people on air, behind the boards or behind the desk. It really is your ministry. You make this happen. Please prayerfully consider giving Iowa Catholic Radio at iowacatholicradio.com or 515-223-1150. Running short on time, always go to iowacatholicradio.com for, Bud, what's the very easy word? Events. All sorts of things happening. The big one that, of course, I want to throw out there is we got various Man Up and women's events coming in November. The big one is, of course, December 8th. That's 6 o'clock at Embassy Suites downtown. Dinner in December with Dr. David Anders. Mass at St. Ambrose Cathedral at 5. Cocktail hour at 6 at the Embassy Suites. Dinner at 7. Dr. David Anders takes the stage at 8 o'clock. You can go buy tickets at iowacatholicradio.com. But if you gear up to really think about going and when you go there, again, if you can prayerfully think about sort of pledges that make this all happen. I know I might sound like I'm begging, but it's something that's worth begging for. Please consider making sure that Iowa Catholic Radio can keep doing what it's doing. We've made big strides in expanding the broadcast by buying more towers and things like this. The stuff you have to do to make the radio station work. Thank you for those who listen. Thank you for those who pray. Thank you for those who give. And please consider that as well. Bud, a wonderful time as always. I can't wait next week to start with the sermons of Newman. They're, again, a hidden treasure.
Yeah, if folks want to work ahead, you can read sermon number 1 from volume 1 of the parochial and plain sermons. I feel like I'm ending class for the day, but it'll be worth it if you want to get ahead a bit.
Absolutely. This is Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our family, our city, state, nation, planet, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for the Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.